This lecture is about the founding of Virginia and life in the Chesapeake Bay area. In 1606, King James I issued a charter to a group of merchants that created the Virginia Company, a joint stock company. A year later, this company started the first permanent English settlement in America at Jamestown, Virginia. Immediately, everything started going wrong. The settlers were most interested in finding, what else, gold, so they didn't bother planting crops or building homes. They chose to settle in an area that could charitably be described as a swamp, meaning more than half of the settlers died of famine or disease during the first 7 months that they were there. On top of that, we know that they landed in the midst of the worst drought in 1700 years. Add hostile Native Americans who were wary of these settlers in the first place, and we have a recipe for disaster. Eventually, the Jamestown settlers negotiated a tentative peace with Powhatan, the chief of Native Americans in the region. Although fresh supplies and new settlers were sent to Jamestown, the colony was almost a failure until a few changes took place. First, rather than all of these settlers being employees of the Virginia Company, they were eventually allowed their own land to improve on. Since they were able to work for themselves, they worked harder. Second, in 1611, John Rolfe planted tobacco, which became the staple crop of the region. By 1620, Virginians exported 40,000 pounds of cured leaves every year. Later that decade, the amount jumped to 1.5 million pounds per year. Because tobacco requires lots of land to produce, the settlement quickly spread away from the main colony on both sides of the James River. These farms became more and more distant, which is great for growing, but bad for defense. Opunchankanaw, Powhatan's brother and successor, soon realized that the English settlers had no intention of leaving, and in fact were spreading further and further inland. In March of 1622, Native Americans attacked the colony, killing 347 colonists, which represents about a quarter of the total. Virginians retaliated, and fighting between the two groups lasted for 10 years until a peace treaty was signed in 1632. Although the fighting did not end the Virginia colony, the Virginia Company could not justify paying for its defense when very little profit was coming in, and King James revoked the charter in 1624, making Virginia a royal colony. He appointed a governor and the upper house of the legislature, called the Council. The lower house had already existed since 1619 and consisted of a representative assembly called the House of Burgesses. 2 delegates from each settlement in Virginia together became the first elected legislature in America. The English presence in the Chesapeake Bay area continued to expand with the second colony, Maryland, which was settled in 1634. Although the colony was established as a refuge for Catholics who were not welcome in Anglican England, Christians of all shapes and sizes were welcome here. Eventually, Protestants began to outnumber the Catholics, and to prevent religious discrimination, the Maryland government passed the Toleration Act, which established religious freedom for all Christians. In both Maryland and Virginia, vast amounts of labor were needed to cultivate the numerous tobacco plantations. Native Americans were not able to provide the amount of labor required, and slave traders from Africa didn't bother coming to the Chesapeake because they could make more money in the Caribbean. Therefore, the labor mostly came from England. Using the headright system, wealthy plantation owners could import workers called indentured servants. Most of these servants were males between the ages of 15 and 24, and most came from farming or laboring families back in Europe. Indentured servitude worked like this. A wealthy landowner would pay for a worker to make a trip to the New World. When that worker arrived there, he would work 6 days a week, 10 to 15 hours a day for a period between 4 and 7 years. In exchange for the labor, the landowner was supposed to provide food, clothing, and shelter. At the end of his term, servants could earn freedom dues, consisting of clothes, tools, livestock, and sometimes land. Unfortunately, immigrants to the Chesapeake first had to survive what colonists called seasoning, which was a nice way of saying that they would contract malaria. Actually, it was more than malaria. It was also typhoid and dysentery and several other illnesses. Up to 40% of male servants didn't last long enough to fulfill their contracts. Now, there's more to this section that I'm not covering here about life in the Chesapeake in the 1600s that is covered in your textbook and you are responsible for. It starts on page 41, so take a look at it. I'm going to probably stop doing a voiceover soon for this section, but you know the drill. Post questions, fill in your identifications, and take the quiz for 2-4.